What do the San Francisco Giants need to do to actually contend in 2024? It's kind of a burning question of the offseason, but it's been swept under the rug a little bit because the Giants fired Gabe Kapler at the end of the 2023 season. There's an ongoing manager search. We have not heard many details about that search, and the MLB playoffs are taking place right now. And on top of that, a lot of Giants fans are particularly interested in the playoffs right now because guess who? Bruce Bochy is having a ton of success so far with the Texas Rangers. Welcome to another edition of the Kerry Crowley Show. Pleasure to be with you. And later on in this show, I will bring in my guest, Roger Munter. We're going to break down what the Giants need to do this offseason to put together a roster that actually gives them an opportunity to, at the very least, contend for a wild card spot, if not contend for a division title next season. And yes, that sounds kind of outrageous when you think about the last 2 years in San Francisco to talk about contending for a playoff spot, and at that, a top playoff spot. But the bottom line is, the Giants need to get back to the playoffs, and they need to get back to winning in the playoffs. And people are not going to sit here, Giants fans in particular, season ticket holders in particular, people who I hear from who inspired me to start doing this show, are not going to sit and wait for the Giants to say, hey, you know what? It's time to rebuild. Actually, we're going to take a step back next season because the last 4 years, save for 2021, have been a step back for the San Francisco Giants, even if they didn't intend to be a step back, even from a spending standpoint, if the Giants didn't sink to the bottom of the league and trade away their most valuable assets. You look at the rosters that they put together, save for 2021, when Buster Posey was back in the fold and Brandon Crawford and Brandon Belt had career years. Kevin Gossman was at the top of his game. And the Giants just simply haven't done enough to field a roster that's competitive at the top of the National League. And we know that because these preseason projections come out every year, whether it be Fangraphs, Pacoda. The Giants are, generally speaking, for the last few seasons, picked to finish right around 500. Sometimes picked to finish under. Maybe the most optimistic projections have them winning 83 or 84 wins. But then we hear the line, internally, the Giants believe that they will be better. And it's really up to them to prove it on an annual basis. Hey, projections are good for one thing. They can give us one data point on where the Giants should be at the end of the season. But in the end, come October 1st, 2nd, or 3rd, whenever the season does end, we'll have the actual data point. We know that based on where the Giants thought they would be in 2022, where the Giants thought they would be in 2023, you can look at those seasons, and I know that some people say they played the kids this season, that was a good development, but to me, they're failures because the Giants had the stated goal, internally, externally, of making the playoffs. And it doesn't matter how you get there. It matters that you do get there, and the Giants did not do it. So to me, it's a failure, and it may sound harsh, it may sound critical, but this is sports. This is entertainment. There are people paying a lot of money to go to games, to watch this team, to stay up late, to watch 162 games. Maybe you're not watching all 162, but maybe you're tuning in for most of them and devoting a portion of your summer, a portion of your life to this team. And for them to fail on a year in, year out basis, this has been the case for much of the last 7 or 8 years in San Francisco, save for 2021, which of course was an incredible season. You can't take away 107 wins. I was there every day as a Giants beat reporter, and I know that everyone wants to look at that season as an outlier. I'll just tell you, everything went right for the Giants that season. They pushed a lot of the right buttons. They coached their players up well, and I don't look at it as much of an outlier as other people do because I was there on a day in and day out basis. But that brings me to another topic, and I'll try and get through this quickly before I bring in Roger, before we talk about how the Giants can reshape this roster to put themselves in a position to contend next season. It brings me to the point of how bad of a look is it for the San Francisco Giants organization to see Bruce Bochy not just in the playoffs, but thriving in the playoffs with the Texas Rangers. The Rangers went into Tampa Bay and took both games from the Rays, made it look easy. The Rangers then play their ALDS series against the Baltimore Orioles, a team that won 101 games during the regular season, and they sweep them. The Orioles hadn't been swept all year, and the Rangers swept them in a best-of-5 series. Bruce Bochy 5-0 in the playoffs so far, and you've got people all over social media saying not just that this is embarrassing for the Giants, but a little revisionist history, that the Giants shouldn't have fired Bruce Bochy. They shouldn't have shown him the door, and I'll tell you one thing. I was there covering the team in 2017, 2018, 2019, which was Bruce Bochy's last season. And I personally am thrilled to see him having success in the postseason again. He was maybe more so than any other person in the sport who's not involved in the journalism side of things, maybe the person who taught me the most about baseball, taught me the most about decision making, and taught me the most about having some respect for the sport. You can look on my wall if you're watching on YouTube, and one of the newspapers behind me is Mike Yastrzemski standing alongside his grandfather Carl Yastrzemski. And if I was standing up right now, the newspaper above that would also be a front page from Fenway Park in 2019. The front page was Bruce Bochy taking me before the Giants' final day game at Fenway Park inside the Green Monster and showing me the history of why it's such a revered place for people in Major League Baseball, because he could point out the signatures of old teammates, of players that he'd managed, of people who'd had a profound impact on him in the game. And he could go through the signatures on the wall of the Green Monster inside there at Fenway Park, and he could tell a story about so many of those people. And I thought that was incredibly cool. To me, it was maybe the single greatest day I had covering Giants baseball, independent of the 2021 NLDS Giants-Dodgers, which of course, going back to 1962, all the history between those teams coming out west in 1958, just an amazing series, and I treasure those memories, I treasure that opportunity. But I also want to remember why Bruce Bochy is no longer managing the San Francisco Giants and why he finds himself in the dugout for the Texas Rangers, because the farther we get removed from 2019, when he made the decision, and yes, it was his decision, to step away from managing the San Francisco Giants, and now he's in the playoffs with the Texas Rangers, it's important to retell that story so that we don't lose the context of why those things were happening. And I think to begin telling that story, you have to go back to the second half of the 2016 season. The Giants are on a tear at the start of 2016. It looks like it's going to be even year magic again. I think they went into the All-Star break either with the best record in the National League, best record in the Major Leagues. I don't know. I wasn't covering the team at that point, but I was watching them closely, and I did know that they were an absolute juggernaut during the first half of the 2016 season. You get to the second half of 2016, and they fall apart. The vaunted bullpen that had been so good throughout Bruce Bochy's tenure in San Francisco was terrible. The Giants couldn't close games. They set a franchise record for blown saves that season, and all of a sudden, they get bounced in the NLDS by the Chicago Cubs. And a lot of people look at that series. If one thing goes differently, maybe Santiago Casilla comes in the ninth inning of Game 4. Who knows? Maybe the Giants were still playing into October, because I think they would have had Johnny Cueto going Game 5, and you remember that was Cueto's far and away best season in a Giants uniform. But nevertheless, the Giants react to their bullpen failures that offseason by giving Mark Melancon a 4-year, $64 million contract. And Giants fans will remember that contract as one of the reasons that Bobby Evans' tenure as the general manager, as their top baseball decision maker following the Brian Sabean era, as one of the reasons that his tenure went south. And so it leads to a disastrous season. Everyone gets older in 2017. The entire core gets older. The Giants lose a few key pieces, and Mark Melancon is not the closer they thought he could be. The Giants lose 98 games. Madison Bumgarner crashes his dirt bike. Just about everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. It's like the inverse of the 2021 season, when everything could have gone right, did go right. 2017 was the exact opposite. And I was there, I think I started in June of that season, covering the team for KNBR as their beat reporter. And it was like they were so thrilled to win one game in a 3-game series. And Brian Sabean even said that later on that season. And in September, when he said the autopsy had already begun on that season for the San Francisco Giants, which I thought was one of the most important lines in describing how south things went for that team, it was just everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. And so you have a season and a half built up of the Giants being a really bad team, because it started in the second half after the All-Star break in 2016. 2017, they lose 98 games, tied for the most in the major leagues with the Detroit Tigers. Giants fans can only wish that that draft produced a superstar at the top, because Joey Bart has not been that guy. For the Detroit Tigers, Casey Mize wasn't that guy either. And so one of the top 2 picks you would have figured would have panned out, but that's from beside the point. So 2018 comes around, and the Giants do this thing where they lean in on their core after 2017. They make the business decision that they are not going to rebuild. They are not going to take 2017 as an indication of what's to come. They look at it as an aberration, the way that some Giants fans view the 2021 season. It's an aberration for the team to be that good compared to really where it's been from 2020 to 2023 under Farhan Zaidi and formerly under Gabe Kapler. And so 2018 rolls around, and Bobby Evans is given the monumentally difficult task of building a contender out of a team that had just lost 98 games while staying under the luxury tax threshold. And I think that that was a really key point in describing why things didn't go well for the Giants in 2018, because he had to add players who were valuable everyday players while spending something like $25 to $30 million. The Giants had little to no breathing room under the luxury tax threshold, and ownership was very clear. The Giants could not go over the luxury tax threshold that year. For whatever reason, they just didn't want to pay it. And so you've got a situation where you're coming off a 98 loss season and you're trying to rebuild, and no one ever wants to give Bobby Evans credit for this, and I get it. But to actually acquire Andrew McCutchen and Evan Longoria in deals that would have theoretically made your team a little bit better if guys bounced back, if Buster Posey, if Brandon Crawford, if Brandon Belt all bounced back and actually performed the way they did in 2021, but it was 2018, then the Giants might have had something. But it was just the most impossible ask of a front office executive in baseball to try to build a winner while not spending much out of a 98 loss team. They were counting on so much, and in the process, they traded away Brian Reynolds, who in the last decade would have been the biggest building block coming through the farm system. And remember, Brian Reynolds was their first pick in the 2016 draft, but the Giants actually didn't have a first round pick that year. They took Brian Reynolds, I believe it was 52nd overall, second round, out of Vanderbilt. They thought they got first round talent, but nevertheless, they didn't have a first round pick because they signed Jeff Samardzija to a 5-year, $90 million deal before the 2016 season. One of the worst, most puzzling deals the Giants have given out. And yes, you want to sign big-time free agents. You want to sign guys who can pitch at the front end of your rotation, but I don't know. I'd have to go back. I was still pretty young at that point. I'd have to go back and really see if Jeff Samardzija was viewed as that type of a guy or if the Giants were just projecting him as that type of a guy. But nevertheless, you look at that deal, you look at the Mark Melancon deal, you look at the Andrew McCutchen deal, and all of a sudden, the Giants really put themselves in a big hole. And while they put themselves in this big hole, they weren't trading away Brandon Crawford's contract, Brandon Belt's contract, Madison Bumgarner's contract, Will Smith's contract. They were holding on to these guys. And so they never entered a full rebuild, which I'm of the belief that if you're a major market team that is going to spend a lot of money every season, at that point, the Giants still believe they should be spending a lot of money. They should be brushing up against the luxury tax threshold, even if not spending over the luxury tax threshold, that maybe you don't need to go through a full rebuild. I think that sometimes following the Cubs and the Astros model from the early 2010s to get themselves to the point where they gutted their entire major league roster, just built these stellar farm systems, and had 4 or 5 horrendous seasons that fans had to sit through before the team could be good again, I actually really don't like that. I like the idea of spending on a year in, year out basis and making things over on the fly. The challenge for the Giants was, after you lose 98 games, you have to spend a lot of money. You can't just use the luxury tax threshold as your soft cap, or in which case they use it as a hard cap. They weren't going over. You have to say, let's deal in reality a little bit. We probably have to spend 20, 30, 40 million more dollars if we're going to realistically turn this team into a contender in the National League West and compete with the Dodgers, who were still absolute juggernauts at that point. Maybe that was the height of Dodgers baseball because they were loaded at that time and the Giants just didn't measure up. And so the end of the 2018 season comes around. Andrew McCutchen had been traded to the Yankees. It was clear that Bobby Evans was not going to continue in that job. And, there were even questions. There were articles being written. Had Bruce Bochy done enough with the talent that had been given to him? Was Bruce Bochy losing his touch on that team? And I think we can look back at those questions and say, well, he just didn't have the roster to win with. He just didn't have the talent to compete with. But there were questions in San Francisco at the time. I remember because I was there and writing about the team, and players weren't as effusive in their praise at the time. They still thought Hall of Fame manager, no doubt, but it was maybe time for a different voice in San Francisco. And the clear-cut view, not just from ownership, not just from the people at the highest levels of the organization, but also from fans at the time. Also from fans who were quick to realize that the Giants were falling behind from an analytics standpoint, from a technology standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, pitching, offense, swing technology, whatever you want to look at, the Giants were falling behind the rest of the industry. And so when they made the decision to fire Bobby Evans, Larry Baer said, they wanted a next-gen president of baseball operations, executive, whatever you wanted to call it at that time. And Giants fans, for the most part, I would say 80, 90%, who'd sat through the end of the 2016 season, who'd sat through the end of 2017, who'd sat through the entire 2018 season, they were fed up and they realized that to compete in modern baseball, the Giants would have to become a little bit more modern. They would have to abandon some of their old school ways. And so for the most part, the idea of bringing in someone new school, someone with different views than a Bobby Evans or a Brian Sabean had, was viewed as a positive in San Francisco. And don't let revisionist history tell you otherwise, because at the time, there were people who were skeptical of Farhan's ties to the Dodgers and maybe would have preferred a Chaim Bloom or someone from the Rays organization or someone from another analytically inclined organization. However, the pretty much consensus at the time was that the Giants had to become more modern. And part of that was moving into a different era in the front office, moving on from Brian Sabean and Bobby Evans. And so they make the decision to hire Farhan Zaidi from Los Angeles. And yes, his Dodger ties were not popular, but there was no denying at the time the Dodgers were the model front office in Major League Baseball. The way that they had built a team that was contending every single season, playing deep into the postseason. Yeah, they hadn't won anything at that point, but it felt like they were on the verge. And it still feels like they're on the verge, even though every year they win 100 games and every year they don't win a World Series unless you're counting 2020, which is just a completely different year. Nevertheless, let's move on. Let's talk about what happens after Farhan Zaidi's hired. Bruce Bochy decides that he wants to continue on as manager of the San Francisco Giants, which was his decision. He wanted to manage the 2019 season. The Giants were not encouraging him to leave the job. The Giants were not saying, hey, if you don't get the job done this year, we are definitely going to be moving on. There was not an ultimatum made to Bruce Bochy. There was none of that. But Bruce Bochy is a smart person. He can read the writing on the wall. He knows that when someone who isn't named Brian Sabean or Bobby Evans, someone who he didn't have a decade plus working relationship with, was in charge, maybe it was for the best for him and for the organization to just take some time off. And I say that because Bruce Bochy, when he decided to retire and he made that announcement in 2019, he was intent on staying away from the game. Maybe it wasn't going to be forever. In fact, he was pretty careful to say that it wasn't going to be forever. I think if the right opportunity came along, he knew he might get back into baseball. But he was absolutely, after a quarter century of managing the Padres and the Giants, ready to take a year off. I think that's natural. Look, the guy had grandkids, and he wanted to be involved in their lives. He had sons living in different parts of the country, and he and his wife, Kim, wanted to go spend time with them. And when you manage a baseball team, the one thing you can't do is spend time with your family. So he said, I'll give it one last go, and then I'm going to take some time for myself. And that is what happened. Bruce Bochy was not forced out by Farhan Zaidi. He was not forced out by whoever the Giants were going to hire. He had the decision to stay on as long as he wanted to. And let's say it gets to 2020, 2021, and let's say he and Farhan aren't clicking and they're failing together, then it would have been fair to say, okay, he probably was forced out at that time. But in February of 2019, when he held his retirement press conference in the dugout in Scottsdale, I was there when the cameras were on, and I was there also throughout the 2019 season when the cameras were off, when Bruce Bochy was not having discussions that were recorded, when Bruce Bochy was being honest and more authentic, and he was going to step away. He wanted to take some time for himself. He wanted to go spend that time with his sons, with his grandkids, with his family, to travel and see the world a little bit, and he wasn't ever going to rule out coming back. But this notion that the Giants forced him out, it's just simply not true. Look, maybe if Brian Sabean comes back and replaces Bobby Evans, maybe if they get a real old school guy in that job, a Dave Dombrowski, who knows? Maybe it's a harmonious relationship that's absolutely going to work. But what I can also tell you is that in discussing Bruce Bochy with Farhan Zaidi and discussing Farhan Zaidi with Bruce Bochy throughout that 2019 season, they were genuinely surprised at how well they got along. I don't think there was any sort of expectation among them. They knew it was going to be a little awkward at first because Bochy had these long-standing relationships with people in the front office, and he was used to doing things a certain way, and Farhan was brought in to change the Giants' way because after failures in 2016, 2017, 2018, that's kind of what was mandated. Like ownership, fans were very frustrated at that time, but Bruce Bochy was genuinely surprised by how much he liked Farhan. I think Farhan was genuinely surprised by how much he liked Bruce Bochy. And I think that if Bruce Bochy wasn't set on stepping away, they could have made it work. But this notion that the Giants showed him the door, simply not true. It's just not factual. And this is someone who, after a quarter century, was afforded to make this decision on his own. And let's say he didn't make that decision in February. Let's say he gets to the end of the season, he sees the Giants in a third consecutive sub-500 year and looks up and, hey, there's not a whole lot of hope at that point. The Giants have been bad for 3.5 years. I think as a manager, you don't want to go through a full rebuild when you've been doing it 25 seasons, when you've won 3 World Series titles. I think the reason Bruce Bochy is back in baseball is because the Texas Rangers were committed to winning in 2023, were committed to spending in 2023, and had a general manager or president of baseball operations. I don't know what Chris Young's title is, but he's someone who Bruce Bochy knew because he managed him. He had a long-standing relationship with him. I think all the factors that got the Texas Rangers to where they are, the factors that enabled Bruce Bochy to sign on and say, okay, if I'm going to do this again, these are the circumstances with which I would do it. I don't think that he was suddenly going to sign on for any old manager job. Kansas City Royals job, Chicago White Sox job become available. I don't think he was suddenly going to say, those are my teams. I think it had to be right. You had to find a team that was dead set on spending money. You had to find a team that was dead set on having star power. You had to find a team that was dead set on competing at the top of the division and in turn making a push to make the playoffs and be in the playoffs. Because I don't think that at the end of the 2019 season, Bruce Bochy thought the Giants would be there. I think realistically, he knew when Farhan was hired, that it was going to be a long time. He looked at those contracts that Brandon Belt, Brandon Crawford, and Buster Posey had at the time, which in 2019 were widely viewed as dead weight. Look, 2021 was not viewed as something that could happen. It wasn't within the realm of possibility. He looked at those contracts, he looked at the Giants situation with the new front office, and he said, you know what, I'm good. And so I think it's important to remember that because you can be really, really happy for Bruce Bochy, and I'm among the happiest people for him during this postseason. I think I've been watching these Rangers games and staying up, after Game 3, waiting to hear him interviewed on the field to see what he would say because he's so compelling and you can see he's got that magnetic presence as a leader. He really trusts in his guys. It's so fun to listen to players talk about Bruce. It's so fun to listen to Bruce talk about a winning ball club and what happens in that clubhouse to get the guys in position to win. It brings back those feelings for Giants fans of 2010, 2012, and 2014. But what you can't do is rewrite history. What you can't do is say, well, the Giants should have never let Bruce Bochy walk because back in 2019, just about everyone thought the Giants needed to go in a different direction in the front office. Not necessarily a different direction in the dugout, but once they committed to that different direction in the front office, Bruce was good. He was fine with stepping away, and he did have grandkids that he wanted to see. He did have sons that he wanted to go visit in different parts of the country, and he didn't want to manage 162 games knowing that it was going to be for a losing ball club, which is essentially what the Giants were going to be because they'd put themselves in such a bad position. From signing Jeff Samardzija, to trading for Andrew McCutchen, to signing Mark Melancon, to giving out these long-term contracts that people thought would never pay off. It just wasn't feasible for the Giants to be good any time in the time that Bruce Bochy wanted to be good. And so he was able to step away. He was able to come back and find the absolute right fit for the Texas Rangers. I think every Giants fan should probably be rooting for Bruce Bochy, although it'll be interesting. Some of the old heads might be rooting for Dusty Baker if the Astros are there. It'll be a fun LCS if it's Bruce Bochy and Dusty Baker. I'm recording this while the Astros are playing. They have the lead, so who knows? But I don't think we can just go back and say that what happened in 2018, the state of the Giants organization, would have led them in any other direction. You can be extremely happy for Bruce. You can be extremely happy for the Texas Rangers, but you have to remember, the Giants wanted to go a different direction, and I think most fans I talked to, in fact, just about every fan I talked to back then, were ready to go in a different direction from a front office standpoint. When they made that commitment, it meant that the Giants were not going to be good immediately, and it meant that their manager, who desperately wanted to manage talented teams, was not going to hang on. Quarter century, he was able to call his shot. He did call his shot. He called his shot to get back in baseball, and now we have the joy of watching him in the postseason. So don't let that ruin your joy. Up next, my conversation with Roger Munter on how the Giants get back to the postseason. What can this team, this franchise do this offseason to turn around two incredibly disappointing, two incredibly frustrating seasons and get back to where this franchise needs to be? Here's Roger.